Good afternoon, everyone. We are Group 2, and today Eryka Uribe, Gerzain Martinez, and myself, Celeste Lepe, will be presenting our book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence by Kellie Carter Jackson. Who is Jackson, you might ask? Well, she is a historian that focuses on African studies like slavery and the abolitionists, violence in politics, historical film, and Black women's history. And in this book, it is being discussed Black abolitionists' attempt to make use of both violence and violent rhetoric as a legitimate tool for achieving emancipation. The book also projects the importance in understanding the 1850s as representation of the most intense political era of American history. It examines how the influence of Black abolitionists contributed to the violent atmosphere that quickened the beginning of the Civil War, while still explaining how nonviolence did not, and perhaps could have not, abolished slavery in the United States. The kind of history that we see in this book is the political and social tension that is taken prior to the Civil War, and how Black abolitionists believe that the only way to abolish slavery was through violence. Jackson brings up what measures Black abolitionists had to take during this time to abolish slavery and what they thought was the best way to do so.
Now, throughout her book, Jackson had used a ton of pieces from Frederick Douglass, such as earlier volumes of the North Star, which later became the Frederick Douglass Papers, in which he had many abolitionists write pieces for. She also used other anti-slavery newspapers such as The Liberator, which was co-published by the well-known pacifist abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, along with abolitionist Isaac Knapp, and The Provincial Freeman, which is co-published by the first Black woman publisher in North America, Mary Shaw Carey, and the Reverend Samuel Ringel Ward. In addition to this, Jackson had also used Walker's Appeal, which were 4 articles published by David Walker in an attempt to give Black abolitionists hope that one day slavery will be abolished. Now, Jackson claims that the shift from moral suasion towards violence by abolitionists in the antebellum period is not talked about enough and has remained unaddressed. She claims that historiography follows the pattern of moral suasion to political abolition, and finally, separatism and emigration. We then learn from her how many historians will use key moments such as the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s as the main turning point that caused Black abolitionists to turn towards violence, whereas Jackson wants to use various moments that took place within the 1830s, 40s, and 50s to show what cultivated their desire for force and their prioritization of violence over moral suasion.
Now, you may be wondering, what exactly is this book about? So, let's run through a few details, shall we? Jackson's book focuses on the idea of whether violence can produce a social change, and she will answer this question by focusing on the ideology belonging to Black abolitionists. Yes, violence can be used to produce change, not just prevent it. You might be wondering, well, how? Jackson allows readers to understand this idea by focusing on the way Black abolitionists used violence, as well as how many other groups were inspired by previous events. You must be thinking I'm crazy. How can violence inspire good people? Well, let's just look at the Haitian Revolution. Unlike most historians who will pinpoint an exact moment that stirred the idea of using violence, Jackson does the opposite. Instead, she uses the revolution as a focal point of where Black abolitionists would draw inspiration from. Jackson writes, quote, "The successful overthrow of slavery during the Haitian Revolution supplied the first example of a Black revolutionary victory achieved through violence." End of quote. The revolution set the footsteps, and soon many other abolitionists drew from this. This excerpt will open the narrative for the reader. David Walker, a Black abolitionist who addressed views on self-defense as a means to end slavery, is a great example of someone who was inspired by what took place in Haiti. In his appeal, which was published in 1829, he spoke about the events several times, and it was clear that he was well informed on what took place on the island. Abolitionists supported Walker's ideals until William Garrison came along in 1831 and spread his views of moral suasion, persuading Americans that slavery was wrong for moral reasons. Black abolitionists began to challenge slavery using Garrison's principles because they believed that since it also appealed to white abolitionists, they would have greater success in doing so. This method had appealed to abolitionists for years, but with laws being passed in Southern territories that prohibited anti-slavery discussions, the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law and the court's decision on Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which made it easier for slaveholders to recover fugitive slaves, abolitionist leaders decided that moral suasion and self-defense would no longer work, so they resorted to force. Jackson provided us with many examples in which abolitionists had used violence in order to stop fugitive slaves from being sent back to the owners. Jackson goes over 4 events that were led by local abolitionist leaders. The first event involved William Parker and his wife as they held off a slave catcher, his son, nephew, and a sheriff from recovering 4 runaway slaves from Maryland, until they received backup from over 84 black men, women, and Quakers. Jackson then spoke about Gerzain Wesley Logan and how he discovered that a man by the name of William Henry was violently arrested. Logan led a group of 2,000 to 3,000 people into this courthouse that Henry was being trialed in and rescued him. The final event is similar to the rescue of William Henry. Louise Hayden, along with many of his followers, stormed into a courtroom to save Fred Wilkins, and 3 years later, Hayden did the same thing along with a giant mob. They broke into court, killed U.S. Marshal James Batchelder, and rescued a man by the name of Anthony Burns. To conclude this presentation would be the recommendation. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm an avid reader who's quite picky with books, and yet I highly recommend this book. Many of us grew up learning about Martin Luther King's peaceful marches and how violence can never solve anything. And yet Jackson manages to successfully challenge this idea. She shows readers that there's a lot more than just waiting around for change. Sometimes you have to fight for change.